paragraphs that are basically a discussion of the facts. I'm not going to go through 138 paragraphs with you. I think you all could read those, but what I'd like to point out to you some of the highlights of that decision so that you at least have a pretty clear understanding of what it means for us. First of all, in the 138 paragraphs, there was one note that I think that occurs in the discussions on page 19 after the paragraph 138. The judge noted, he said, however, Mr. Lawson's exercise of his rights as a township supervisor and as an authority board member are not unfettered. The exercise of a person's rights, even constitutional rights, are not absolute and without limitation. The decision is very well organized and very well written, but during the case, Mr. Lawson and his counsel argued that he had a constitutional right to ask questions of Mr. Kovach and the staff, and that no one could stop him from being a board member and also a supervisor. And so Judge Lucas was careful to point out that, yeah, you have those rights, but they're not unlimited, or they're not unfettered, as he used. And then he, in the case, he cited the very case that Mr. Lawson's counsel cited. We also cited it as well. It's the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania's decision in the borough of Blonox, where they ruled that a zoning hearing board member could be removed for, quote, ultra-virus acts. This was a case in where the zoning hearing board members hired their own counsel without authority and ran up a bunch of legal fees. And he goes on to explain that for an individual, an ultra-virus act has been found where municipal board members take official action to serve their personal interests rather than those of the governing body that they were appointed to serve. This was if you read his decision very carefully, this was a very important part of Judge Lucas's decision. He felt that Mr. Lawson was more concerned about serving his own personal interests and the personal interests that he had as a Union Township supervisor versus the hat he wore as a PCSA board member. Judge Lucas held that the testimony credibly demonstrated that the relationship history between Mr. Lawson and Mr. Kovach shows a pattern of Mr. Lawson acting in a manner that is inimical and harmful to the interests of PCSA and its ratepayers. And if you look up the Webster's definition of inimical, it's defined to mean being adverse, often by reason of hostility. So he uses the word inimical several times in his decision, which basically says that Lawson expressed hostility in the way he was adverse to the point of hostility, and his behavior prevented Mr. Kovach from doing his job. If you look up the definition of inimical, that's a small word that says a lot about our case. Judge Lucas found that Mr. Kovach's service to PCSA has been exemplary, and he is viewed as a critical employee for the organization. And he found that the loss of Mr. Kovach would be detrimental to PCSA's overall operation. He found that when Mr. Kovach opposed Mr. Lawson's effort to secure a bulk billing arrangement for Union Township, Mr. Lawson responded in a hostile manner. He found that Mr. Lawson then began to make requests for large amounts of information and documents. And when he uses the word request in his decision, you can gloss over it, but he's not just referring to right to know requests. He's referring to all the requests that Mr. Lawson made, because we put in at the hearing, we made it clear to the court, this wasn't just about the 4 right to know requests that had multiple parts, but it was about all the requests and all the emails that we put into evidence that Mr. Lawson had bombarded Mr. Kovach with. So the judge picked up on that and used the word request, and when he was referring to right to know requests, he specifically referred to them. He found that Mr. Lawson provided superficial explanations of how the board packets he received were lacking in critical information. You all know the board packets that you received were pretty thorough. He found that Mr. Lawson's right to know request did not follow any refusals by Mr. Kovach to provide Mr. Lawson with any requested information. In fact, he found that he was never denied any information. He found that despite being moored by the solicitor, which was me, that he should tone down his communication with Mr. Kovach, but Mr. Lawson persisted despite this warning, and threatened Mr. Kovacs with a report to the state ethics complaint. Judge Lucas specifically found in his decision that Mr. Lawson berated and abused Mr. Kovacs at board meetings, and he uses the word meetings with the plural, which I think was a very important finding. Judge Lucas found that Mr. Lawson threatened to sue PCSA and Mr. Kovacs despite being advised by the solicitor not to make such threats because it could be considered retaliatory, and despite PCSA boards voting separately to refrain from engaging in conduct that could be considered retaliatory. I said all along to you during the course of this case in executive session that I never quite understood the strategy of Union Township filing this declaratory judgment lawsuit against each of you individually, except of course they left out the Union Township folks, and Mr. Kovacs individually, and I never understood the strategy of attaching Mr. Kovacs' letter to that complaint. In my mind, that was the dumbest move I've ever seen in my life, and this decision, if you read it carefully, was won because of that move. There's no question that Judge Lucas was offended by that declaratory judgment action. He found it to be retaliatory, not only against Mr. Kovacs, but also against all of you for following the recommendation of an independent investigator. And he found that Mr. Lawson made good on his threat at the executive session when he said he was going to sue everybody if we sided with Mr. Kovacs, and he found that the testimony that he said that was credible, even though Mr. Lawson denied having said that during his testimony. He found that he had been warned not only by myself, but also by Mr. Levy, and by the motion that you passed, not to engage in anything retaliatory. And then at the end of the case, I thought he did quite a good job. He found that he said that Mr. Lawson, any one thing that Mr. Lawson did probably would not be a basis for removal. But when you took the totality of his actions together, it was sufficient to find a just cause for removal. And then in conclusion, he stated that a public officer is understood by all to be a public trust. To honestly administer such trust, the individual in whose charge it is placed must give his undivided loyalty. With regard to PCSA and its ratepayers, Mr. Lawson has not done so. In other words, he found that Mr. Lawson, by his action, violated the public trust and did not give PCSA his undivided loyalty. His loyalties were elsewhere. He found that his loyalty was to protect his business and his personal reputation, and his loyalties were to Union Township. And then he ruled that we had just cause to remove him. Very well written decision. If you haven't read it, it's a long read, but it's not a difficult read. When you do read it, if you look at it with the idea of that declaratory judgment action, I think you will find that tipped the scales in our favor, and was probably the most significant reason why we prevailed in that case, because it was a tough decision for this judge to remove somebody. There's some strategy things going forward that I'd like to discuss with you about your rights in executive session. I don't think they would be appropriate in a public meeting, but I'm happy to answer any questions about the decision and the procedure from this point forward if you have any.